The storm came in the way bad things always do, quietly at first, then all at once. Lydia had noticed the sky changing sometime around noon, that particular shade of gray-white that old-timers in the Dakotas called the lid coming down. She'd been walking for close to 4 hours by then, her boots soaked through the leather, her fingers so cold inside her gloves that she could no longer feel the tips of them. The travel bag hanging from her right shoulder had started to feel like a boulder somewhere around the second hour. She'd switched it to her left, then back to her right, and now she carried it pressed against her chest like a child, both arms wrapped around it, hunching her shoulders against the wind that cut across the open plain with something almost personal about it. She was 25 years old, she had 11 silver coins, a change of clothes, her teaching certificates, and a small photograph of her mother wrapped in a handkerchief at the bottom of the bag. That was the complete inventory of what remained of her life. The town of Harlan's Creek was 8 miles behind her. She had not looked back at it once. 3 days ago, she had been a school teacher with a modest but dignified position, a rented room above the milliner's shop, and enough routine to mistake it for stability. Then Harlan Dupree, school board chairman, land speculator, and the kind of man who smiled at everyone to their face and schemed against them the moment they turned around, had summoned her to a meeting that wasn't really a meeting. It was a verdict. She had refused his son's offer of courtship the previous autumn. She had also, in a moment she did not regret even now, reported the boys cheating on a county examination. 2 acts of defiance. 1 pink slip of paper slid across a desk. "We regret to inform you that your contract will not be renewed." She hadn't cried in Dupree's office. She'd waited until she was back in her room above the milliner's, with the door locked and her face pressed into her pillow. She'd given herself exactly 1 evening for that. Then she'd packed her bag. There was a town called Ridgecall, some 15 miles northeast of Harlan's Creek. Someone at the general store had mentioned it once, said they had a schoolhouse that had sat empty for 2 years since their last teacher married and moved to Oregon. Lydia had no confirmation of this. She had no letter, no invitation, no guarantee of anything. She had the vague story of a stranger in 15 miles of Montana winter between herself and a maybe. She had started walking that morning when the sky was still pale and cold but manageable. Now, the sky was coming down. The wind shifted from the north, and the temperature dropped so fast she felt it in her teeth. The snow that had been dusting down all morning thickened into something serious, horizontal sheets of it that stung her face and turned the landscape ahead of her into a moving white wall. She could no longer see more than 20 yards in any direction. The wagon road she'd been following had disappeared beneath fresh accumulation, and she'd been navigating by instinct and stubbornness for the last 30 minutes. Her left boot had a crack in the sole. She'd been aware of it since morning. Now the cold was coming through it with every step, and her left foot had gone from aching to numb to something worse. That strange hot-cold sensation that she knew, distantly, from things her father had told her about frostbite. Keep moving. You stop. You die. She said it aloud, her voice strange and muffled inside the roar of the storm. It was the kind of thing that sounded dramatic in warmth and obvious in cold. Out here, it was just true. She almost missed the fence post. It was barely visible, a dark vertical line against the white, and she nearly walked past it before something registered. She stopped, squinting against the wind, reached out and grabbed it with both hands. Wood. Old, weathered, solid. A fence running in both directions, but she could see another post maybe 15 feet to her left, and beyond it. Was that a light? She stood there for a long moment, genuinely unsure if she was seeing something or manufacturing hope out of desperation. The wind screamed past her ears, snow plastered itself against the right side of her face. Then the light moved. Not dramatically, just the way a lamp flickers when a door opens somewhere inside a building. A living light, not a trick of the storm. She followed the fence. The ranch house was bigger than she expected and darker than it had any right to be. There were lights in 2 downstairs windows, but the place had the quality of somewhere that had been partially abandoned. Not physically, the structures were all sound, she could see that even through the storm, but emotionally. A house where someone had started to let things go. There was a barn off to the left, and she could hear cattle somewhere beyond it in the dark, restless in the storm. 2 horses stood in a small paddock near the house, heads low, snow caking their manes. Someone had left them out too long. She climbed 3 porch steps, stamped her boots out of some half-conscious habit, and knocked on the front door. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. Her knuckles were so cold that she couldn't feel the contact. She was knocking mostly by watching her hand do it. "Hello?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Hello, is anyone—" "I'm sorry to disturb you. I've been caught in the storm and I—" The door swung open. The man standing in the doorway was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, despite the cold that must have been pouring in past him. He had dark hair gone a little gray at the temples and several days of beard on a face that was blunt and angular and entirely unreadable. He looked at her the way a man looks at an unexpected problem. Not with hostility, exactly, but with a kind of flat appraisal that didn't yet have a verdict in it. He was maybe 35, maybe 38, hard to tell with men who worked outside. He said nothing, just looked at her. "I'm sorry," Lydia said. Her teeth were chattering now that she'd stopped moving, and she hated that. "I was trying to reach Ridge Call. I lost the road about an hour back. I've been following your fence line." She paused. I'm not dangerous. I'm a school teacher. My name is Lydia Mercer." He kept looking at her. His eyes were a dark gray-green, and they moved over her with that same flat assessment, taking in the ice on her coat, the bag clutched to her chest, her face, which she knew must be half-frozen and red and entirely unglamorous. "You walked from where?" he said. "Harlan's Creek." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, more like someone revising their initial calculation. "In this?" he said. "It wasn't this bad when I started." A silence. The wind screamed around the corner of the house and threw a handful of snow across the porch between them. "Come in," he said, and stepped back. The kitchen was warm. That was the first thing, that wave of heat that hit her when he closed the door behind them, the kind of warmth that makes the body suddenly aware of exactly how cold it has been. Her legs went briefly unsteady. She caught the edge of the table and held on. He noticed. Didn't say anything about it. "Sit down," he said, nodding at a chair near the stove. He moved to the stove himself and added wood to it with practiced efficiency, not looking at her. She sat, put her bag on the floor beside her, pulled off her gloves with some difficulty and pressed her hands together. There was a pot of something on the stove that smelled like coffee, a cast iron pan on the counter with the remnants of supper in it, beans maybe, and salt pork. The kitchen was functional and clean, but had the spare quality of a room managed rather than lived in. No curtains on the window, no tablecloth. A shelf of dishes that were stacked with mathematical precision by someone who was being careful rather than comfortable. "You're alone?" he said, still not looking at her. "Yes. Headed to Ridge Call. I'd heard they might need a teacher." He turned then. "Might have heard wrong," he said, not unkindly. "The Ridge Call school board filled that position last month. Woman came up from Billings." She absorbed this. She was proud of how level she kept her expression. "I see," she said. "Thank you for telling me." He poured coffee into a tin cup and set it on the table in front of her. Then he pulled a chair out across from her and sat down, and there was something about the directness of it. He wasn't hovering, wasn't pretending to busy himself with something else, that she noted. He sat like a man who was accustomed to looking at problems straight on. "Where are you from?" he said. "Ohio originally. I've been in the territory 4 years." "Family?" "My father passed 3 years ago. My mother before that. I don't have— No family." He nodded, put his hands flat on the table. She noticed they were heavily scarred, the hands of someone who had been doing hard physical work since childhood. "My name is Wade Coulter," he said. "This is Black Hollow Ranch. I've got 400 head of cattle, 1,200 acres, and a crew that goes home to their own places in the winter months." She waited. There was something deliberate in how he was speaking, like someone reading from a list they'd prepared. "I've got 2 boys," he continued. "Eli's 7, Cole's 12. Their mother died 18 months ago." "I'm sorry," Lydia said. He acknowledged this with a slight dip of his chin, not quite a nod. "I can't run this ranch through the winter and look after those boys the way they need to be looked after. I've been managing it badly." He said this with a flatness that was somehow more honest than any self-pity would have been, just a statement of fact. I've been thinking about putting a notice in at the trading post in Cedar Falls looking for someone who could come out here, help with the house and the boys, cooking, maybe some lessons, if she was willing. Lydia said nothing. But that takes time, Wade said. Putting a notice in, waiting, getting letters, deciding who to trust. He looked at her steadily. And then you knocked on my door. The kitchen was very quiet, except for the sound of the storm outside and the stove. Lydia wrapped her hands around the tin cup. The coffee was strong and slightly bitter, and the best thing she'd ever tasted. Mr. Coulter, she said carefully, what exactly are you suggesting? He didn't hesitate. Marriage. She stared at him. Not the kind you're thinking, he said, and there was the first small evidence of discomfort in him, a slight stiffness in his jaw, a straightening of his already straight back. I'm not looking for that. I'm talking about a practical arrangement, a name on paper that makes things simpler. So you're not a hired woman sleeping under my roof and the whole territory deciding what that means. So the boys have a household with some legal standing. He paused. You'd have your own room, you'd have privacy. You'd be treated with respect. I'm not a man who raises his voice or his hand. You'd have everything you needed. She looked at him for a long time. And what would you have? She asked. Someone capable running this house. Someone looking after my sons who isn't going to bolt come spring because they got a better offer. He met her eyes. Someone who needs this enough to stay. It was that last part that landed cleanest. Not a compliment, not a romantic notion, a calculation, and an honest one. He needed someone who had enough at stake to commit to it. She set down the coffee cup. I want to be clear about something, she said. I'm not a woman who makes permanent decisions out of temporary desperation. I've done that once, and it cost me a position and 2 years of my life. I'm not asking you to make a permanent decision out of desperation, he said. I'm asking you to make a practical one based on circumstances. If it doesn't work, if this arrangement becomes something either of us can't live with, we talk about it, like adults, and figure out what comes next. She noticed he didn't say you can leave. He said we figure it out. That small difference mattered. The wind hit the side of the house like something thrown, rattling the glass in the kitchen window. Lydia glanced at it involuntarily, then back at Wade Coulter. I want to meet your sons before I decide, she said. Something in his face relaxed, fractionally. Eli's asleep, Cole's in the other room. He stood. I'll get him. Cole Coulter came into the kitchen like someone coming to identify a suspect. He was 12 years old and tall for it, dark-haired and dark-eyed like his father, and he stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed over his chest and looked at Lydia with an expression so precisely between suspicion and contempt that she almost wanted to laugh. He did not laugh. This is Miss Mercer, Wade said. I heard you through the wall, Cole said to his father. Not to Lydia. Deliberately, not to Lydia. Cole? She's a stranger. He said it simply, as though it ended the argument. She's someone who was lost in the storm, Wade said, and now you want to marry her. There was a silence. Lydia considered several responses and discarded all of them. I want to have a conversation, Wade said. That's what adults do. We talk about things before we decide them. You already decided. Cole, that's enough for tonight. The boy looked at his father for a moment with an expression that was complicated and mostly furious, and then he looked at Lydia for the first time, really looked at her with those dark eyes that were going to be exactly his father's when he was grown, measuring her up, finding her, she suspected, somewhat lacking. She doesn't look like she can run a ranch, Cole said. She doesn't have to run a ranch, Wade said. I run the ranch. Mama could ride. Cole. The word was quiet but final. Cole uncrossed his arms, looked at the floor for a moment, then looked back at Lydia. Where'd you come from? He said. Not warmly, but it was a question, not a statement. She took it. Harlan's Creek, she said. But originally Ohio. That's far. It is. Why'd you leave? Cole, Wade started. It's all right, Lydia said. She looked at the boy. Someone powerful decided they didn't like me. and I didn't have enough money or connections to fight him. So I left. Cole considered this. Did you cry? Yes. He seemed surprised she admitted it. When? At night, alone, in my room. She paused. Once was enough. He looked at her for another moment. Some of the contempt had thinned slightly. Not gone, not even close to gone, but maybe thinned. Then he looked at his father. I'm going to bed, he announced, and left the kitchen as abruptly as he'd arrived, his socks silent on the wood floor. Wade watched the doorway for a moment. Then he turned back to Lydia and said, with something that was as close to an apology as she suspected he got, He's protecting his mother's memory, Lydia said. That's reasonable. Wade looked at her. Yes, he said quietly. It is. Bishop Tad. Eli was 7 years old and had been asleep, but he wasn't now. When Lydia went to use the outhouse that night and came back through the dark hallway, she found him standing at the top of the stairs in his nightgown, holding a candle stub, staring down at her with wide brown eyes. Are you real? He whispered. Yes, she said, keeping her voice soft. Are you? He thought about this with the gravity only 7-year-olds can bring to ridiculous questions. I think so, he said. Are you going to stay? I don't know yet, she said honestly. I might. He seemed to accept this with less distress than she'd expected. I dreamed about a lady coming, he said, but she was in a red coat. Your coat is brown. Sorry about that. It's okay. He looked at her for another moment. I'm Eli. I know, I'm Lydia. He nodded, seeming satisfied by this exchange, and padded back to his room. She stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the storm batter the house, and then she walked to the small room Wade had showed her earlier, with its clean but threadbare quilt and its window that looked out into nothing but white. She sat on the edge of the bed. 11 silver coins, a change of clothes, her teaching certificates, her mother's photograph, and a man at the end of the hallway who had offered her an arrangement that was cold-blooded enough to be honest about what it was, and honest enough that she was still considering it. She thought about it for a long time, sitting on that bed in her damp coat, listening to the wind. Then she lay back and stared at the ceiling. In the morning, the storm had not ended, but it had softened. The world outside was buried in blue-white, the kind of beautiful that only exists somewhere you could die. Lydia was up before the boys. She wasn't sure what made her go to the kitchen and start the fire in the stove. Some restless practical instinct, maybe. Or just the need to do something with her hands while her mind kept working. She found coffee in a tin and a skillet hanging on the wall, and there were eggs in a cold box and salt pork on the shelf. She was cracking the 4th egg when she heard boots on the kitchen floor. You don't have to do that, Wade said. I know, she said, without turning around. I wanted to. He sat down at the table. She could feel him watching her. She kept her eyes on the pan. I'll do it, she said, finally. A pause. Do what? She turned around, met his eyes across the kitchen. The arrangement, whatever you want to call it. She set the spatula down on the counter. But I need things made clear between us before anything is put on paper. He nodded. Say them. My room stays mine, always, without exception. Agreed. I am not a replacement for your wife. I'm not going to try to be her, and I don't expect you to pretend that I am. Something moved in his jaw. Agreed. If I am teaching the boys, I teach them my way. I'll hear your concerns, but I won't be overruled for the sake of keeping the peace. Fair, he said. And if this stops working, if it becomes something neither of us can live with, we talk about it like adults. She used his own words back at him deliberately. And figure out what comes next. Together. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I have one condition. She waited. You're honest with me, he said. Whatever you think, whatever's not working. You tell me. I don't want someone managing me. He paused. I've had people manage me since Rachel died. Everyone telling me the boys are fine, the ranch is fine, everything's handling itself. None of it was true and everyone knew it, and nobody said it. Lydia looked at him. This was the first real thing he'd said to her. Not practical, not calculated, but actual. She could see the strain of it in his face, the way a man looks when he says something true after a long time of not doing it. That I can promise, she said. I'm not a very good liar. He stood up. Okay, he said. Then we'll do it. She turned back to the eggs before she let herself react to that in any visible way. Breakfast is ready in 5 minutes, she said. Wake your sons. She heard him walk down the hallway, heard him knock on doors, heard Cole's flat groan of protest and Eli's muffled immediate conversation starting before he was even fully awake. She stood at the stove and moved the eggs around in the pan and tried not to think too hard about what she'd just agreed to. Practical, she thought. This is a practical decision. But she remembered Eli at the top of the stairs with his candle stub, asking if she was real. And she remembered Cole's dark eyes measuring her in the kitchen doorway with that fierce, painful protectiveness. She had a feeling that nothing about what came next was going to be particularly practical. They were married 6 days later, in the front room of Black Hollow Ranch. The justice of the peace came out from Cedar Falls on a borrowed horse and looked at the whole situation with the particular expression of a man who had seen stranger things in the territory and knew better than to ask questions. The ceremony was short. Wade wore his cleanest flannel shirt, which he'd ironed himself. Lydia had seen the iron on the kitchen counter that morning and had not offered to help because she understood instinctively that it was something he needed to do for himself. She wore her second dress, the better one, dark blue wool, slightly too large through the shoulders but decent. She had no veil, no flowers, no guests. Cole sat in the corner chair with his arms crossed and watched the proceedings with the expression of a judge observing a trial he'd already decided the outcome of. Eli stood beside Lydia. She hadn't asked him to. He'd simply appeared at her left side 10 minutes before the justice arrived and stationed himself there with the gravity of someone who understood he was performing a function, though he might not have been able to name it. When the justice asked if there were any objections, Cole opened his mouth. Wade looked at him. Cole closed his mouth. The justice moved on quickly. When it was done, and the papers were signed, and the justice had departed back into the cold, the four of them stood in the front room in a silence that had several different textures. Wade was looking at the signed papers. Eli was looking at Lydia. Cole was looking at the floor. "Are we having something special for supper?" Eli asked. "What would you like?" Lydia said. He thought about it with total seriousness. "Biscuits," he said, "and honey." "I can do that," she said. She went to the kitchen. Behind her, she could hear Wade saying something quiet to Cole, too low to make out. And then Cole's voice, tight and thin. "It's too soon, Pa. It's too soon." And then Wade's voice again, still low, and silence. She put the flour on the counter and measured it without measuring, the way her mother had taught her, by feel and instinct. She could hear the wind still going outside. It had been going for 6 days, and she'd stopped expecting it to stop. Black Hollow Ranch pressed its weight around her. The creak of its walls, the smell of its wood, the cold drafts that slipped under every door. It was not welcoming. It was not warm yet. It was a place that had been hurt and had not finished deciding whether to let anyone new into it. She understood that. She mixed the biscuit dough and kept going. Mos. That night, after the boys were in bed, Lydia sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to a woman named Margaret, who had been her friend in Ohio and was now living in Nebraska with her husband and 2 daughters. She told Margaret that she had taken a position on a ranch in Montana and that she was well and managing and that the winter here was extraordinary. She did not say killing, though the word came to her, and that she would write again when spring arrived. She did not mention the marriage. She wasn't sure how to explain it yet. She put the letter in her bag to post the next time someone went to Cedar Falls. Then she sat for a while without writing anything, listening to the ranch settle around her. It made a lot of noise, old wood in the cold, beams contracting, something rattling in the eaves. She'd grown up in a house like this, where the building itself seemed to breathe. She thought about this justice of the peace and his carefully neutral expression. She thought about Cole's voice. "It's too soon, Pa." She thought about Eli at her left side, stationed there like a small, serious sentinel. She thought about Wade's hands flat on the table and the way he'd said someone who needs this enough to stay. Not as cruelty, but as honesty, which was somehow harder. She was a woman married to a stranger in a house full of grief. She had no guarantee of anything. She had no plan beyond surviving the winter, proving she was capable, and being honest with a man who had specifically asked her to be. It was not a fairy tale. It was not even particularly comfortable, but she was alive and she was warm, and somewhere down the hall 2 boys were sleeping and the ranch was still standing, and in the morning she would get up and do the next thing, and then the next. That was enough. For now, that was enough. She blew out the lamp. The first week was the hardest, and not for the reasons Lydia had expected. She had anticipated practical difficulties, learning the layout of the house, finding where things were kept, understanding the rhythms of a working ranch in winter. She had anticipated Cole's hostility, which arrived daily and reliably, like bad weather you've been warned about. She had anticipated loneliness, the particular kind that comes from being surrounded by people who don't yet know you. What she had not anticipated was Rachel. Rachel Coulter was everywhere in that house, in the specific way that someone who has died too young is everywhere. Not as a presence, but as an absence that had a shape. Her absence had weight. It pushed against Lydia from corners of rooms she hadn't entered yet, from the closed door at the end of the upstairs hallway that no one mentioned, from the way Wade sometimes stopped in the middle of a sentence and looked at a particular spot on the wall for a moment before continuing. There was a rocking chair in the front room that nobody sat in. Lydia noticed it on her first full day and filed it away without comment. She did not sit in it herself. There was a blue ceramic pitcher on the kitchen windowsill, chipped at the spout, which Eli told her without being asked that his mama had kept wildflowers in during summer. He said it the way children sometimes say important things, casually, in the middle of something else entirely, while he was sitting at the table watching her make oatmeal. She put flowers in that pitcher, he said, the yellow ones that grow down by the creek. She said they smelled like pepper. They sound beautiful, Lydia said, and didn't move the pitcher. The house itself was solid and well built, the kind of place that had been put together by someone who intended to stay. But it was also a house that had been managed rather than tended for the better part of 2 years. The front curtains were faded and brittle along the hem where sunlight had rotted the fabric. The winter root vegetables in the cellar had been put up adequately but not generously. Someone had done the work without enthusiasm. Wood was stacked, but the kindling supply was inconsistent. And twice in the first 3 days, the kitchen stove had gone cold in the morning because whoever had banked it the night before had done it wrong. Lydia said nothing critical about any of it. She simply started managing things differently, one small piece at a time, waiting to see if anyone noticed or objected. Wade noticed. He said nothing for 4 days. Then, on the 5th morning, he came into the kitchen to find that she had reorganized the dry goods shelf. Not dramatically, just logically, so that the things used daily were at eye level and the things used occasionally were higher up. And he stood in front of it for a moment with his coffee cup in his hand. "You moved things," he said. "Yes." She kept her back to him, working at the stove. "If that's a problem, I can put them back." A long pause. "No," he said. "It makes sense." That was all. But it was something. Cole, for his part, conducted himself like a prosecuting attorney building a case. He watched Lydia with focused attention, cataloging her actions, and she could see him waiting for her to do something that confirmed whatever verdict he'd already reached. He wasn't openly rude. His father had apparently made something sufficiently clear on that front. But he had mastered the art of the pointed silence and the precisely angled shoulder, turned just far enough away from Lydia in any shared room to communicate that she was being deliberately not looked at. She did not chase his approval. She had learned long ago, in classrooms full of 12-year-olds who had decided they didn't want to learn, that chasing a child's approval was the fastest way to lose it entirely. What she did instead was teach him chess. It happened almost by accident. She had found a chess set in a wooden box on the bookshelf during her first week. Good pieces, ivory and ebony, the kind a man buys when he intends to use them regularly. She took it down and set it on the kitchen table one evening after supper, not saying anything to anyone about it, and began playing a game against herself to remember the rules she'd learned from her father. Cole wandered in 20 minutes later, as she'd suspected he might. He stood in the kitchen doorway in the same posture he always used, arms crossed, weight on his back foot, ready to retreat, and watched her move pieces for a moment. "You're doing that wrong," he said. She looked up. "Am I?" "The bishop. You moved it wrong. It goes diagonal." "Show me," she said. He unfolded his arms. By 9 o'clock they were 40 minutes into a genuine game, and Cole had forgotten, temporarily, to be hostile. He played the way she suspected he did everything, with fierce concentration and no patience for losing. He took his time over each move, brow furrowed, and when Lydia took one of his pawns with a move he hadn't seen coming, he looked up at her with something that was almost indignation. "You did that on purpose," he said. Yes, she agreed. That's how chess works. He looked back at the board, his mouth pressed thin. He started planning his response, and she watched him do it and said nothing and thought, there you are. There's the real one. He won that game and the one 2 nights later. She won the third. By the fourth game, he was no longer standing in doorways when she was in a room. He was still prickly. He still said things that were designed to establish distance. Mama did this differently, or we don't usually do it that way. And Lydia took each of these without flinching and without rising to them. One evening he said, "You're not like I thought you'd be." She was darning a sock that had an ambitious hole in the heel. "What did you think I'd be like?" He shrugged, looking at the chessboard. "Like you were trying too hard. Like you wanted us to like you." "I do want you to like me," she said honestly. "But I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not to make that happen." He moved a knight, didn't respond, but she could see something in the set of his shoulders that was different from before. Something that had dropped a fraction. Not acceptance, not even close to that, but something. Eli required no campaign at all. Eli had decided on Lydia's first full morning that she was someone he could talk to, and he talked to her with the relentless enthusiasm of a child who has been storage for conversation all winter with no suitable outlet. He told her about the horses by name and temperament. He told her that the big barn cat was named Senator because his father said the cat was fat and useless and good at napping, which was apparently his father's view of politicians. He told her that the creek behind the south pasture froze solid in January, and that last year Cole had fallen through it, and their father had gone in after him, and they'd both come back wet and furious, and nobody had mentioned it since. He also told her on their third day, while she was teaching him his numbers at the kitchen table, that he thought about his mama every day. "What do you think about?" she asked him, keeping her voice careful. "Different things," he said, drawing a 6 that looked more like a backwards 9. "Sometimes I think about her voice. She sang sometimes. Not good." He paused. "I miss the not good singing." Lydia looked at the boy's small, serious face bent over his numbers. "That makes sense," she said. "The ordinary things are what you miss most." "Cole doesn't talk about it," Eli said. "Some people don't," she said. "It doesn't mean they miss her less." Eli looked up at her. "Do you miss anyone?" "Yes," she said. "My mother and my father." "Are they dead?" "Yes." He absorbed this with the particular solemnity of a child who has recently come to understand that death is a real thing that happens to real people. "That's sad," he said. "It is," she agreed. "But you get to keep the memories. Nobody can take those." He looked back at his numbers and drew another 6, this one better. "Okay," he said, apparently satisfied. And that was that. Wade Coulter was the most difficult of the three to read. This was partly his nature and partly, Lydia suspected, something he'd developed deliberately. A man who runs a large operation alone learns to keep his interior workings private, because too much visible uncertainty costs you the confidence of the people who depend on you. He was functional and consistent and almost entirely opaque. He was also, she noticed over those first weeks, not sleeping well. She heard him sometimes at night, boots on the kitchen floor at 2 or 3 in the morning, the sound of the stove being opened and poked at, the particular quiet that meant someone sitting alone in a dark room trying to outthink something. She never went down. It was not her place, and she understood that without needing to be told. But she started leaving a pot set up for coffee before she went to bed each night, just needing a flame under it. She never mentioned it. He never mentioned it. But the pot was always moved by morning, and sometimes there was a single cup left by the sink that told her she'd guessed right. They were not close, but they were learning the geography of each other's edges. The real test came in February, and it arrived in the form of a woman named Clara Holt. Clara Holt was the wife of Black Hollow's nearest neighbor, whose spread sat about 4 miles east. She appeared at the ranch door on a clear afternoon with a covered dish and a smile that had several different things going on behind it simultaneously. She was perhaps 40, well-dressed for a ranch wife, and she looked at Lydia with the particular expression of a woman who has already formed an opinion and come to deliver it in person. "We've all been wondering about you," Clara said, with a brightness that was just a touch too sharp. "Wade's new wife. It's quite the story, isn't it, coming in from the cold like that?" She laughed a little. Not unkindly, but not gently either. "I appreciate you making the trip," Lydia said. and meant it, because she did appreciate company, even the complicated kind. Clara came in for coffee and sat at the kitchen table and talked about the community with the fluency of someone who had been tracking its social landscape for decades. Lydia listened and asked questions and poured coffee and gathered information the way she'd learned to do in any new situation, quietly, without giving too much of herself away. Rachel was just loved, Clara said at some point, with the deliberate care of someone placing a stone to see how it lands. Truly loved, not just by Wade. Everyone here. She was one of those women who makes a place feel like something. She sounds remarkable, Lydia said. Clara looked at her with something that was trying to be kindly concern and landing closer to assessment. It must be strange, she said, coming into all of that. Her house, her boys. A pause. Her husband. Lydia looked at her across the table and decided to be precise. It's a significant responsibility, she said. I don't take it lightly. Of course not. Clara sipped her coffee. Then, with the air of someone who has been building toward a thing, some folks have wondered, I'm not saying I have, but some folks have wondered about the circumstances, whether it was perhaps a bit sudden. It was sudden, Lydia said pleasantly. I was lost in a blizzard. He had an empty household and 2 children who needed stability. We made a practical decision. Clara blinked. She had apparently expected either defensiveness or apology, and Lydia had offered neither. Practical, she repeated. Yes, a short silence. Clara set down her cup. Something in her recalibrated, not warmly, exactly, but with a kind of grudging adjustment. Well, she said, I suppose practical is better than a lot of alternatives. After Clara left, Lydia stood at the kitchen window and watched the woman's sleigh move away down the track, and she felt the weight of the community settling around her like snow, light individually, heavy in accumulation. She knew what Clara Holt would tell people in Cedar Falls and at the trading post and over supper tables scattered across 4 miles of Montana winter. She knew because she'd grown up in small places and understood how they worked. The story would be whatever it was going to be. She couldn't control that. What she could control was what happened inside this house. She thought about what Wade had said the morning she agreed to the arrangement. I don't want someone managing me. I've had people managing me since Rachel died. Everyone telling me the boys are fine. She thought about Cole's shoulders. She thought about Eli and his not good singing memory. She thought about the closed door at the end of the upstairs hallway. Then she went back to the kitchen and started on supper. The idea came to her sometime in late February, arriving the way useful ideas sometimes do, sideways, while she was doing something else. She had been helping Eli with his reading when she noticed how quickly he moved through the primer she'd found in the bookshelf, and she thought, he needs more than this. He needs other children. And then she thought, so do the other children around here need someone who can actually teach them? She brought it up to Wade that evening while he was going over his account ledger at the kitchen table. She waited until he'd reached a natural pause in what he was doing. She'd learned already that interrupting him mid-calculation resulted in a response that was more clipped than his default, which was already economical. I'd like to start a school, she said. He looked up from the ledger. Here? In the front room, to start. 2 or 3 days a week for the children in the area. Anyone who wants to bring their children. She kept her voice level, practical. Eli needs other students. And from what I can gather, there are at least 8 or 10 children within reasonable distance who aren't getting any formal lessons. Wade looked at her. That's not what you came here to do. No, she agreed. But it's what I'm qualified to do. And it's what needs doing. A pause. The front room's large enough. I wouldn't need anything but chalk and some boards. The families could contribute what they're able. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through the logistics the way he seemed to do with everything, methodically, from the outside in. Clara Holt's got 3 children, he said finally, and the Brennan family on the North Road has 4, some of the ranch hand families. He turned this over. You'd be doing this on top of running the house. I can manage it. He looked at her for another moment. Why? He said, and it was a genuine question, not a challenge. Because I'm a teacher, she said simply. It's what I know how to be. He looked back at his ledger. All right, he said. Do it. She had expected more resistance. She had prepared several additional arguments. She looked at the top of his head, bent over the accounts, and decided not to say any of them. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said, without looking up. You'll be the one managing 8 children in a room that hasn't had furniture rearranged since 1883. That's punishment enough. She stood there for a moment, unsure if she'd imagined it, but the corner of his mouth had moved. The first school day was held in early March, with 4 children besides Eli in attendance, ranging in age from 6 to 13. Clara Holt sent 2 of her 3. The Brennan family sent their eldest girl, a serious-faced 11-year-old named Petra, who arrived carrying her own slate, as though she'd been waiting for exactly this opportunity. And a ranch hand named Dirk, who had a son close to Eli's age, asked with some embarrassment if the boy could come, and Lydia said yes without hesitation. Cole did not participate. He stood in the kitchen doorway for 20 minutes during that first session, arms crossed in his classic posture, watching Lydia run the room. She did not look at him directly. She did not ignore him either. She simply taught. She told the children about rivers, because rivers were interesting and had math and geography and history all bound up in them. And she let Cole observe without making it a thing. After the children left and Eli had gone to help his father in the barn, she found Cole still in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, eating an apple with the concentrated attention of someone who is actually thinking about something else. "You could join the class," she said. "I don't need lessons," he said. "Everyone needs lessons," she said. "Even teachers." He chewed his apple. "Who teaches you? Right now? Your father's been teaching me about cattle management, whether he knows it or not. And Eli teaches me things about patience on a daily basis." Cole looked at her sideways, the apple, the sidelong look. He was thinking. "Were you actually a teacher?" he said. "Before?" 3 years at a school in Harlan's Creek. "And they fired you?" "Yes." "Why exactly?" She considered how much to tell him. He was 12, not 7. And she had the sense that managing what he knew would insult him more than the truth. "The school board chairman wanted me to marry his son," she said. "I said no. He found a reason to dismiss me." Cole was quiet for a moment. "That's not fair," he said, with the uncomplicated directness of someone who hasn't yet learned to dress unfairness in polite language. "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." He finished the apple and looked around for somewhere to put the core. She handed him a scrap cloth for it, without comment. He took it. "Mama taught me to read," he said, not looking at her. "I know," she said. "You're very good at it. I can see it in how you read to Eli." He went still for just a moment, the kind of stillness that means something landed. Then he tossed the apple core in the bin and walked out of the kitchen without saying anything else. But that night, at supper, he sat down at the table and passed the bread to Lydia before serving himself, which was not something he'd done before. It was a tiny thing. It was enormous. March moved into itself with the particular stubbornness of Montana. Warm days that promised something, and then nights that snatched it back. Mud and cold alternating like a debate that wouldn't resolve. The school grew to 8 students by the 3rd week. Petra Brennan, it turned out, was ferociously intelligent and had been teaching herself from a single arithmetic book for 2 years. Lydia started bringing her more advanced material and watched the girl's face when she worked through it, that absorbed focus that good students get when they finally have something real to chew on. Lydia was writing a letter to her old teacher supply contact in Ohio, the one who had sold her textbooks at cost back in Harlan's Creek, asking if the man still had any primers he could part with, when Wade came into the kitchen one evening and stood at the table for a moment. She looked up. He had something in his hand, a folded piece of paper. "From Clara Holt," he said, setting it on the table. She opened it. It was a note, written in Clara's round, practiced hand, thanking Lydia for the school sessions. The last line read, "My Thomas told me last night he wants to be a river engineer. He is 8 years old and I blame you entirely. Please don't stop." Lydia set the note down. The corner of her mouth moved. "She said that?" Wade said, reading upside down. "She blames me entirely," Lydia confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. She looked up at him and found him looking at the note with an expression that was difficult to read, the way most of his expressions were difficult to read. But there was something in it that was adjacent to, not pride exactly, but something like a recognition. "You're good at this," he said. Not a compliment exactly. An observation, a fact being placed on the table. "It's the only thing I've ever been consistently good at," she said honestly. Everything else I'm working out as I go." He looked at her then, directly, the way he sometimes did when she said something he hadn't expected. "That's honest," he said. "You asked me to be," she reminded him, and he held her gaze for a moment in that quiet kitchen, with the March wind going outside and the stove keeping the room warm, and she could see him deciding something. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the small, careful way that real decisions actually get made. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I need to tell you something about the ranch," he said, "about what I've been seeing this winter." She set down her pen. "Tell me." He put his hands flat on the table. That gesture she'd noticed from the first night. The gesture of a man who squares himself before saying something difficult. "I've lost cattle," he said. "More than winter loss accounts for. Found a stretch of fencing on the east boundary cut clean, not broken. Third time this winter." He looked at the table. "One of my hands found boot tracks near the south herd last week. Multiple sets." "You think someone is taking them?" she said. "I think someone is taking them," he agreed. "And I think it's organized." She absorbed this. "Have you talked to the marshal?" "Marshal's out of Cedar Falls, and he covers 400 square miles of territory. He's not rushing out here over some fence cuts and missing cattle that could be winter strays." Wade's jaw was tight. "I've got no proof, just patterns." "What kind of patterns?" He looked at her like he hadn't expected the question, or rather, like he'd expected a different question. He'd expected the practical ones. What do we do? How bad is it? She'd asked the kind of question that meant she was going to think about this with him, not just receive information from him. He started talking. He talked for nearly an hour, laying out what he'd seen over the winter. The fence cuts, the tracks, the timing, the strange way the missing cattle were all from the eastern boundary where the land got rougher and less visible from the house. Lydia listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions that made him pause both times, because they went somewhere he hadn't thought to look yet. When he was done, they sat in a silence that was different from the silences they'd had before. It was a thinking silence, the kind 2 people share when they're working on the same problem. "The Railroad Land Survey," she said finally. He looked at her. "Clara Holt mentioned it," she said. "The Northern Continental Survey team that came through last fall, looking at land routes east of here. Did they come through your land?" Wade's face did something complex. "They surveyed the boundary," he said slowly. "East boundary. And if a rail line goes through that eastern corridor," she said, "whose land would they need?" He was very still. "That's a lot of cattle to drive off before you've got enough leverage," she said carefully. "But it's not an unreasonable amount if you're trying to convince a man his operation is failing." The kitchen was very quiet. "It's a theory," he said. "It's a theory," she agreed. "You'd need more before you took it anywhere." He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not warmth exactly, but something that was the predecessor to it. Something opening, fractionally, where something had been closed. "Where did you learn to think like that?" he said. "My father," she said. He was a very patient man. He believed in following the thing all the way back to where it started. Wade looked at her for another moment. Then he stood up, very carefully, like a man who doesn't want to make a sudden movement in a room where something fragile has just appeared. "It's late," he said. "You should rest." "You too," she said. He picked up the lamp from the counter and walked toward the hallway. At the doorway he stopped. She could see only his profile, half in shadow. "Thank you," he said, "for listening to all that." "You don't need to thank me for that," she said. "That's what—" She stopped herself. She had been going to say that's what a partner does, but it felt like too large a word for where they were. "That's what you asked me here for," she said instead. "The honest conversations." He stood in the doorway for another moment. "Right," he said. "Good night, Lydia." It was the first time he'd used her name without it being necessary. She noticed. "Good night, Wade," she said. She listened to his footsteps go down the hall and up the stairs. She listened to the house settle around her in the cold. She looked at the note from Clara Holt still on the table. "My Thomas wants to be a river engineer. I blame you entirely." And she thought about cattle and fence lines and railroad surveys and a man who had started, cautiously, to think out loud with her. She thought about Cole passing her the bread without comment, about Eli's not good singing memory, about the blue pitcher on the kitchen windowsill that she had not moved. She was still a stranger in this house. She knew that. The house had not decided about her yet, and perhaps she hadn't decided about it either, about whether this was somewhere she was managing a crisis or somewhere she was actually building a life. But she was still here. That was something. In a Montana winter with a cut fence on the eastern boundary and a railroad survey in the background and a man upstairs who had just trusted her with the shape of his worry, she was still here and she intended to stay. Whatever came with the spring, she would face it where she stood. That much she knew. Spring came to Black Hollow the way most things came to that part of Montana, without asking permission and with no particular consideration for what it disrupted. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, leaving behind mud so deep it swallowed boot heels and held them. The creek behind the south pasture broke its ice in the second week of April, with a sound like rifle shots that brought both boys to the upstairs window at 2 a.m, and Lydia stood in the hallway listening to Eli explain to a half-asleep Cole exactly what he thought had caused it, with the confident authority of someone who had recently learned something new and intended to use it. She had been at Black Hollow 3 months. In that time, she had learned that Wade Coulter woke at 5, regardless of when he'd gone to bed, that Cole's chess game had developed a reckless, aggressive quality in the middle game that was going to be either brilliant or catastrophic depending on the day, and that Eli was capable of asking 27 consecutive questions about a single topic without any apparent need for the answers to be connected to each other. She had also learned that the problem with the eastern boundary was not getting better. Wade had been tracking it with the quiet, methodical attention of a man who knows he is building a case and cannot afford to be wrong. He kept a small notebook now. She had not asked about it. He had not offered, but she had seen it on the kitchen table late at night, filled with his cramped, precise handwriting, dates, locations, numbers, the shapes of what was happening, laid down in ink so he could look at the pattern instead of just carrying it in his head. In April, 2 of his ranch hands were ambushed on the eastern road. They were not killed, but Denny Marsh, who had worked Black Hollow for 6 years, came back to the ranch on a borrowed horse with his arm in a makeshift sling and a gash above his left eye that needed stitching, and the quiet way he told it, sitting at the kitchen table while Lydia cleaned the cut and Wade stood with his back against the wall, very still, was somehow more alarming than a dramatic account would have been. There were 4 of them, Denny said, maybe 5. Came out from the tree line on the south side of the Kelmar Road. They weren't random. They knew where we were going. Wade said nothing. They took the horses, Denny said. Both of them, mine and Cal's. He paused. Cal's got 2 broken fingers. He's at Brennan's place. Mrs. Brennan setting them. Lydia pressed a cloth to the cut above Denny's eye with steady hands. The man was trying not to show how shaken he was, and she appreciated the effort without being fooled by it. His hands on the table were not quite still. Did they say anything? Wade asked. One of them did. Told us to tell you. Told us to tell you that Black Hollow's running out of road. Denny looked at the table. That's the exact words. I made sure I remembered them. The kitchen was very quiet. All right, Wade said. You'll stay here tonight, both of you, when Cal gets back. After Denny had gone to the bunkhouse and the boys were in bed, Wade sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open and Lydia across from him with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold. Neither of them had said much since Denny's account. Wade had been thinking in that way he had, deep and still, like a river that's most dangerous when it's not showing its current. Running out of road, Lydia said. It's a message, he said. They want me to know this is escalating. They want you scared enough to sell. Yes. She looked at him. He was not scared. That was the thing about Wade Coulter that she had come to understand in 3 months. He was not a man who scared easily, and when he was frightened it didn't look like fear, it looked like granite. His jaw set and his eyes went flat and something inside him compressed into a smaller, denser, harder thing. Right now he looked like granite. The railroad survey, she said. Has to be. He turned a page in the notebook. I've been asking around, carefully. The Northern Continental has been buying up land in this corridor for 18 months. Mostly small operations, mostly quiet. 3 families I know of sold in the fall and moved on. Nobody talked about why. He paused. But I talked to Ed Ferris last week, who used to neighbor one of those families. He said the man came to him before he left and told him there had been pressure. That's the word he used. What kind of pressure? Fences cut? Stock gone missing? A barn fire? Ruled accidental. He looked at her across the table. The same pattern, starting small and building. She thought about this. How long do you think you have before they move from harassment to something worse? He was quiet for a moment. I think, he said slowly, that we are already at something worse. He was right. She knew it before he said it. The ambush on the road was not harassment. It was a demonstration. It was two men who worked for Wade Coulter being hurt to show him what came next if he didn't cooperate. You need to go to the marshal, she said. I need proof the marshal can use. His voice was flat and controlled. A theory about a railroad survey and a cattle count and a couple of men who got jumped on a road. That's not proof. The marshal comes out here, looks around, writes a report, and goes back to Cedar Falls. And then the men who did this know exactly who I talked to and what I said. You can't fight this alone, she said. I'm not alone, he said. And it was said plainly, without weight or theater, and she understood that he meant her, and she sat with that for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Then tell me what you need, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Keep the boys safe. Keep the school running. He paused. And keep your eyes open when I can't be here. You see anything? Anything that doesn't belong? You come to me first. She nodded. All right. He closed the notebook, started to stand. Wade. He stopped. She looked up at him. Don't do anything by yourself that you'd have stopped me from doing. He looked at her for a moment with that unreadable face. Then something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. That's a fair rule, he said. He went to bed. She sat in the kitchen for another hour, listening to the spring wind come off the mountains, thinking about railroad surveys and cut fences, and a man who had said, I'm not alone, like it was a simple fact. May arrived and the trouble accelerated. 17 head of cattle vanished from the north herd over a single weekend while Wade and his hands were busy with the spring calving on the south pasture, spread too thin, exactly as someone had planned. A section of fence on the western boundary was found flattened, not cut, as though something heavy had been driven over it repeatedly. One of the young hands, a boy of 19 named Pete, found a dead calf near the creek with its ear tag removed. Not a predator. The cuts were clean. The message was getting louder. And then Clara Holt came to school one Tuesday morning, and instead of sending her children in, she stood at the door and looked at Lydia with an expression that had moved past assessment into something that was almost apology. I need to talk to you, Clara said, not as a neighbor, woman to woman. They sat in the front room after the children had settled to their slates. Clara held her gloves in her hands and looked at them. My husband had a visitor 2 weeks ago, she said, a man from the Northern Continental Land Office, named Garrett Pell. Lydia went still. He was very pleasant, Clara said, very professional. He explained that the railroad intended to run a line through this valley and that it would be each all beneficial to properties in the area that cooperated with their land acquisition program. She paused. He also mentioned very pleasantly that properties that did not cooperate could expect certain complications regarding land title disputes and water rights challenges, things that take years in court and cost a great deal. What did your husband say? Lydia asked. Harold told him to get off our land, Clara said, but Harold is not the point. She looked up at Lydia directly. The point is that Pell asked Harold about Black Hollow specifically, about Wade, about whether Wade was distracted, whether the ranch was being managed as well as it used to be. She set her gloves on her knee. He mentioned the new wife. The front room was quiet except for the scratch of chalk on slates. He was asking whether I was a weakness, Lydia said. Or a distraction, Clara said. Or both. She met Lydia's eyes. I thought you should know how they're thinking about this. After Clara left, Lydia sat in the front room for a few minutes while the children worked, and she thought about a man named Garrett Pell, who had visited Harold Holt to measure the edges of his neighbor's operation, who had asked about the new wife. She thought about what that meant, what it would mean to someone running an organized campaign to acquire land through attrition and fear. They would have looked at Wade Coulter and seen a widower managing alone, and then they would have looked again and seen a new wife, arrived under unusual circumstances, and they would have calculated disruption, instability, a man whose attention is divided. They had made a mistake. They'd looked at her arrival as a crack in the foundation. They hadn't considered that she might be load-bearing. She went back to teaching. But something in her had shifted and settled into a harder, quieter place. The night it broke open was in the third week of May. The weather had been threatening all day. A dark bank of cloud building from the west that had the hands watching the sky and the cattle restless. Wade had taken Denny and two other men out to the eastern boundary before supper to check a report of fence disturbance, and he had told Lydia he'd be back before dark. He was not back before dark. She had fed the boys and gotten Eli into bed and was sitting in the kitchen trying to read when Cole came downstairs in his boots and coat at 9 o'clock, with his jaw set in a way that was his father's jaw exactly. "He's not back," Cole said. "I know," she said. "He said before dark." "I know." Cole stood in the kitchen doorway. He was 12 years old and trying very hard not to be frightened, and she could see how much effort that was costing him because it was written all over his face in the gaps between the effort. "He's probably held up at the boundary," she said carefully. "If they found something significant, he'd want to document it before he lost the light." "You don't know that," Cole said. "No," she admitted. "I don't." He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table. She poured him a cup of warm milk without asking, which she would not have done 2 months ago. He would have resented it, but which she did now because she understood that sometimes a person needs something warm and ordinary while they're waiting out something frightening. He drank it without commenting on it. They sat in the kitchen together and listened to the wind build outside. Sometime around 10 o'clock, she heard what she thought was a horse, then definitely a horse, multiple horses, coming up the ranch road. She was at the front window before the thought had finished forming. 3 riders. Wade in front, Denny on his right, a third man she recognized as Cal. They were moving fast, but not in the panicked way of emergency. She let out a breath. Cole was already pulling on his coat. "Stay inside," she said. "He's my father." "Cole." She turned and looked at him directly. "Let him get in the door before you're on top of him. Give him 10 seconds. He stopped. His jaw worked. He gave her a look that could have stripped paint, but he stayed. Wade came in the front door with cold air and urgency, and the particular expression of a man who has confirmed something he'd suspected and is not pleased about being right. He looked at Lydia first, then at Cole. "Boys all right?" he said. "Eli's asleep," she said. "We're fine. What happened?" He pulled off his coat. "We found a camp," he said. "East side of the boundary in the timber. Not a couple of men passing through. A setup. Cook fire, a lean-to, rope for horses. Someone has been using that site for weeks." He looked at Lydia. "And we found something else." He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the kitchen table. It was a paper folded twice, water-stained at one corner. She picked it up and opened it. It was a survey map. A rough one, hand-drawn but detailed. She could see the creek, the ranch house location marked with an X, the pasture boundaries. And in the eastern corridor, in pencil, a line, running straight through the Black Hollow land. "That's the route," she said. "That's the route," he confirmed. "And the camp we found puts their men on my land. That's trespass. That's enough for the marshal, combined with the ambush on Denny and Cal." He looked at the map in her hands. "That's enough to go to Cedar Falls tomorrow." "Who's Garrett Pell?" she said. Wade went still. "Where did you hear that name?" "Clara Holt. He visited Harold 2 weeks ago. He's the Northern Continental Land Acquisition Agent." She set the map down. "He asked Harold about you specifically, about Black Hollow." Something crossed Wade's face, a kind of controlled anger, the kind that comes from confirmation rather than surprise. "Pell," he said quietly. "I've heard that name from 2 other ranchers. Both of them sold. Both of them said afterward there'd been—" He stopped, looked at Cole, who was listening with sharp, bright attention. "Go to bed, Cole," Wade said. "Pa, I need you rested and sharp tomorrow. That means sleep tonight." He met his son's eyes. "I'll tell you what I can in the morning." Cole looked at his father. Then he looked at Lydia with an expression that was complicated. It had assessment in it and something else that was harder to name, something that might have been the beginning of trust. "Fine," he said, and went upstairs. When his footsteps had faded, Wade sat down heavily at the table. He looked tired in a way that had more in it than one long day. It was the accumulated weight of months of managing this alone before she arrived, and then managing it alongside her, and now having it reach a point where it couldn't be managed quietly anymore. "I'm going to Cedar Falls at first light," he said. "Denny and Cal are coming with me. I need you here." "I'll be here," she said. He stopped. Started again. I need you to take it seriously. Being here, not just, I need you to understand that while I'm gone, if something happens, I understand," she said. He looked at her. She held his gaze. "There's a shotgun in the coat closet," he said. "Second shelf, box of shells on the left." "I've used a shotgun before," she said. "My father hunted." He nodded slowly. "Don't open the door to anyone you don't know." "Wade," she said it levelly. "Go to Cedar Falls, get the marshal, come back. I will keep your sons safe while you're gone." He looked at her for a long moment across the kitchen table, with the survey map between them and the wind going outside, and she could see him deciding whether to trust what she was telling him, not because he doubted her exactly, but because trust was something he had learned to be careful with. "All right," he said finally. He left before dawn. She stood at the front window and watched the three riders go down the dark road and disappear into the gray-blue Montana morning. And then she turned around and went to the coat closet and checked the shotgun and the shells and loaded it and put it back where it had been, just in case. The day passed without incident. She ran the school in the morning, 6 children, Eli among them, working on multiplication and a map exercise that happened to give her an excuse to think about the geography of the eastern boundary without appearing to think about it. She made supper. She read to Eli. She played one game of chess with Cole, which she lost badly because she was distracted, and he was sharp and he noticed both things. "You're not paying attention," he said. "No," she admitted. "Because Pa's not back yet." "Because your father went to deal with a serious situation and he'll be back when he's back." Cole looked at her across the chessboard. "You're worried." She considered lying, decided against it. "Yes," she said. "Some." He looked at the board for a moment, then he said quietly, "She used to do that, Mama, when Pa was out late during calving season. She'd sit in the kitchen and pretend to do something else, and every time a horse went by, she'd look at the window." Lydia said nothing. She let the silence sit. "She was better at pretending not to worry than you are," Cole said. It wasn't cruel. It was just true, delivered with the precision of a boy who was also trying to manage his own fear by talking around it. "I'll work on it," Lydia said. Something almost like a smile crossed his face. Almost. They were washing the supper dishes, Cole drying, Lydia washing, Eli already in bed, when she heard it. Horses. But not on the road. From the south side. She stopped, turned off the lamp on the counter with a deliberate hand, stood in the suddenly dark kitchen, and listened. Hooves. 3 or 4 horses moving without lights, coming around the south side of the barn. Cole had gone very still beside her. He heard it too. "Cellar," she said quietly and clearly. "Now." "What?" "Cole." She turned and looked at him in the dark. "Get your brother and get into the cellar. Lock the interior bolt. Do not come out until I come for you or until your father's voice." He stared at her for a moment in the dim kitchen. He was 12 years old and frightened, and she could see in his face the exact instant when he decided to trust her. "Okay," he said, and he went. She heard him on the stairs, fast but quiet, the kind of quiet a child learns when quiet matters. She heard Eli's door and the low, urgent murmur of Cole explaining. She moved to the coat closet. Her hands were steady, which surprised her faintly. She took the shotgun off the shelf and loaded both chambers and held it with the barrel pointed at the floor. Through the front window she could see them now. 2 men coming around the south corner of the house, moving low. No attempt to hide. Confident. The kind of confidence that comes from having done this before. She heard the cellar bolt slide home. The back door exploded inward. The first man through it was large. She registered that in the half-second before everything else, large and moving fast, carrying something that looked like an axe handle. He stopped when he saw her in the dark hallway, and in the fraction of a second that his brain was processing the unexpected, a woman, standing in the dark, with a shotgun leveled at the center of his chest, she said very clearly, "Stop." He didn't stop. He made the mistake they all make, which is assuming that a woman with a gun is primarily a woman and only secondarily someone holding a gun. She fired the first barrel into the wall 8 inches to his left. The sound in that hallway was enormous. It filled the space entirely, wall to wall and floor to ceiling. And the man dropped the axe handle and threw himself sideways against the doorframe with a sound that was not quite a word. The second man was behind him, and he had stopped. "I have one more barrel," she said, and her voice was steady, and she was aware that her heart was going at a rate that was not compatible with the calm of her voice, but she kept them separate, the inside and the outside, the way she'd kept them separate in Dupree's office when he'd handed her the pink slip. The second man had his hand slightly away from his body. He was looking at her with an expression that was recalibrating rapidly. "Lady," he said, "you don't—" "I want you both outside," she said, "backing out the way you came in. You turn around, I fire. You do anything I haven't asked for, I fire." She paused. "I'm a school teacher, and I'm not having a good month, so I need you to take me seriously right now." There was a moment, 3-4 seconds, where it could have gone any direction. Then the second man said to the first, "Back up." The first man, who was pressed against the doorframe with plaster dust in his hair from where the shot had torn into the wall, looked at the barrel of the shotgun and backed up. She followed them to the back door, kept the barrel level. Her father had taught her, keep the barrel still and everything else can shake if it needs to. From the front of the house she heard shouting, then a shot. Outside, not near. Then another. Then voices she recognized. Denny's, and another that took her a moment to place, and then placed itself as the marshal, which meant Wade had come back with more than just documentation. The two men at her back door heard it too. The second one looked at her with the expression of someone doing a fast and unfavorable calculation. "Put your hands where I can see them," she said, "and wait." They waited. When Wade came through the front door 4 minutes later, he found his wife standing in the back hallway with a shotgun leveled at two men sitting on the kitchen floor with their hands on their heads, and the wall beside the back door had a hole in it that was going to need patching. And she looked at him across the kitchen in the lamplight and said, with a steadiness that frankly astonished him, "Marshall's outside?" "Yes," he said. He was staring at her. "Good," she said. "These two need to go with him." He looked at the men on the floor, he looked at the wall, he looked at her. She lowered the shotgun. Her hands had started shaking, finally, now that she was allowing them to. She kept them at her sides and didn't let him see. "The boys are in the cellar," she said. "They're all right. I need to go get them." She walked past him to the cellar door and she knocked twice and said, "It's Lydia, and it's over, and everyone's safe." And she heard the bolt slide back. Eli came out first, immediately and completely, wrapping his arms around her waist with the conviction of someone who had decided during his time in the cellar that he intended to hold on to this particular person indefinitely. Cole came out behind him. He stood in the doorway and looked at Lydia, and then he looked past her at his father, and then he looked at the hole in the kitchen wall. "You shot the wall," he said. "On purpose," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with those dark eyes that were going to be his father's eyes. "Okay," he said quietly, and he walked past her to his father, and Wade put a hand on the back of his son's neck and said nothing, which was the right thing. The marshal took the two men from the kitchen floor and three more who'd been caught outside, and he took the survey map and Wade's notebook and Denny and Cal's account of the ambush in February and Clara Holt's testimony about Garrett Pell's visit to Harold, which she had written down and signed at Wade's request that afternoon in Cedar Falls. It was not over. Not yet. The machinery of it, the railroad company's legal exposure, the other cases in the corridor, the question of what had happened to the three families who'd sold and moved on, all of that was still ahead of them, and it would take months to work through. But the men in the kitchen were in custody. The map was evidence. The name Garrett Pell was now in a marshal's report. Late that night, after the marshal and his deputy had gone, and Denny and Cal were in the bunkhouse, and the boys were finally genuinely asleep, Wade and Lydia sat at the kitchen table in the wreckage of the evening. 2 cups of coffee, the lamp turned low, the hole in the wall a dark gap in the lamplight that she was going to be seeing in her peripheral vision for weeks. He had been quiet for a long time. She had let him be. Finally, he said, "You could have hidden in the cellar." "Yes," she said. "It would have been the safer thing." "Probably," she agreed. "But someone needed to be between those men and where your sons were hiding." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "So I was." He was looking at her. She could feel it. "You were scared," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. "It didn't show." "It showed plenty," she said. "You just got here at the end." She paused. "My hands shook for 20 minutes after." He was quiet for a moment. "Mine too," he said. "When I came through that front door and saw—" He stopped. "Mine too." She looked up at him. He was looking at the table, but there was something different in his face, something that had come loose from wherever he'd been keeping it fastened. Something that was not the granite and not the flat appraisal and not the careful, deliberate distance he had maintained for 3 months with the precision of a man who had decided that distance was the only safe thing. "That was—" he started, stopped again. "I didn't expect—" "You don't have to say it," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to." She waited. "I expected you to hide," he said. "Not because you're a coward, because it was the reasonable thing to do. I set you up to be the person who kept the house and taught the boys and maybe helped me think through problems late at night. I wasn't thinking of you as someone who would—" He stopped and looked at his hands on the table. "I've been doing you a disservice," he said. "Since the beginning. I told myself it was practical and honest, but I was still keeping you at the edge of this family, like you were temporary, like you were filling in." The kitchen was very quiet. "I know," she said. She said it without bitterness, just a fact, acknowledged. He looked up at her. "I don't want that to continue," he said, "whatever it means. However we figure it out." He paused. "I don't want you at the edge of this." She looked at him across the table, this man who had offered her a contract in a blizzard, and kept his word to the letter of it, and who was sitting in a broken kitchen at midnight trying to say something that was several sizes larger than his usual vocabulary allowed for. "We'll figure it out," she said. He nodded, looked at the coffee in his cup. Outside, the spring wind moved across Black Hollow Ranch, and the cattle were quiet in the dark fields. And somewhere above them 2 boys were sleeping in their beds, and the hole in the wall was going to need patching in the morning. There was a great deal still ahead of them. She knew that. The legal proceedings, the community, the long work of what it meant to be a family assembled out of necessity and loss, and 3 months of grinding through a Montana winter together. None of it was going to be simple or fast or smooth. But the house was standing, the boys were safe, and the man across the table had just said, plainly and without decoration, that he did not want her at the edge of this anymore. She thought that was worth sitting with for a while. So she sat with it and drank her coffee and let the night settle around them, and did not ask for anything more than that. The hole in the kitchen wall got patched on a Thursday. Wade did it himself, early morning before the boys were up, mixing plaster with the focused attention of someone who needed something physical and finite to do after a week of things that had been neither. Lydia watched him from the kitchen table over her coffee cup and said nothing until he'd smoothed the surface and stepped back to look at it. "It'll need a second coat," she said. "I know," he said. "And paint. That section's going to be lighter than the rest." He turned and looked at her with an expression that was caught between exasperation and something warmer. "I'm aware of how wall repair works, Lydia. Just making sure you're committed to finishing it," she said, and looked back at her coffee. He made a sound that was almost, not quite, but almost, a laugh. And then he went to wash the plaster off his hands, and she sat with the almost laugh for a moment before letting it go. That was how it was in the weeks after the raid. Incremental, unglamorous, full of small moments that mattered more than they appeared to. The marshal had taken 5 men into custody that night, and the legal proceedings that followed moved with the grinding slowness of territorial justice, which was to say, slower than anyone wanted and faster than nothing. A deputy came out twice to take additional statements. Wade made 3 trips to Cedar Falls for meetings with the county prosecutor, who was a precise, humorless man named Abbott that Wade disliked instinctively and trusted professionally. The name Garrett Pell appeared in the county record for the first time in mid-June, attached to a warrant. He was not in Cedar Falls when the warrant was served. He was not, it turned out, in Montana at all. He had left the territory sometime in the 2 days following the raid at Black Hollow, which told the marshal everything he needed to know about how organized the operation had been and how quickly it could dissolve when the pressure reversed direction. "He'll be in Wyoming or Idaho by now," Wade said, the evening Abbott's letter arrived. He was sitting at the kitchen table reading it, and Lydia was across from him, and Cole was at the counter pretending to read a geography book, but very obviously listening. "They'll find him," she said. "Maybe." He set the letter down. "Men like Pell are good at becoming someone else when they need to." "Then they'll find whoever he becomes," she said. "That warrant doesn't expire." Wade looked at her. He did that more often now. Looked at her when she said something, really looked, the full attention of those gray-green eyes that had been so carefully rationed in the early months. It still surprised her occasionally, the directness of it. She was not entirely used to being looked at like she was the thing being considered rather than the person doing the considering. "You sound very certain," he said. "I'm choosing to be certain," she said. "There's a difference, but it works about the same." Cole turned a page of his geography book with the elaborate casualness of someone demonstrating that he was absolutely not listening to this conversation. The legal proceedings mattered, but they were not, as it turned out, the primary territory being navigated at Black Hollow that summer. The primary territory was Wade. He had said, in that late-night kitchen conversation after the raid, that he didn't want her at the edge of the family anymore. He had said it plainly and meant it. But meaning a thing and knowing how to act on it are two different skills, and Wade Coulter had spent 18 months building walls that were structurally sound and load-bearing and not easy to dismantle simply because he'd decided they should come down. He was a man who had loved one woman deeply and lost her in the worst way, not to argument or slow estrangement, but to fever, fast and senseless, in the third week of November 1885. Leaving behind 2 boys and a ranch and a man who had learned to function by compressing everything that hurt into a smaller and smaller space until it took up almost no room at all. The compression had kept him standing. It had also, Lydia was beginning to understand, become its own kind of habit, almost its own kind of comfort. The pain stayed contained. Nothing new could come in and break him because there was no opening for it. The night of the raid had made an opening. He didn't know what to do with it. She saw it in the small ways. He would start a sentence and then manage it back into something more neutral. He would sit near her, genuinely near, not across a wide table, and then find a reason to stand up. One evening she was helping Eli with a letter he was writing to a cousin in Billings, and she reached across the table to correct his spelling, and her hand brushed Wade's sleeve where he sat beside the boy, and he went so still for just a moment that it was almost comical. Except that it wasn't, because she understood what it cost a person to hold that still. She did not press. She had promised herself that when she made the decision to stay, she would not chase, she would not manage, she would not fill the silence with performance. She would simply be here, honestly, and let him work through it at whatever pace the working required. But June moved into July, and July was hot and full of the ordinary business of a working ranch in summer. And sometimes she lay in her room at night and was honest with herself about the fact that it was not entirely easy. She was not made of patience. She had some, acquired through years of teaching children who didn't want to learn and living alone and managing situations she hadn't chosen. But she was also a woman who had feelings that didn't always sit quietly when she told them to. And she had, over 6 months of mornings and evenings and late-night conversations and chess games and shared worry, developed feelings about Wade Coulter that were not practical and not convenient, and not what either of them had agreed to. She did not tell him this. It was not the right moment, and she had enough hard-earned sense to know that timing is not a small thing. What she did instead was have a conversation with Cole. It happened accidentally, the way the important conversations at Black Hollow always seemed to. It was a Tuesday in late June, school out for the summer, and she was in the garden, a project she had started in April that was showing genuine results, beans and squash and a row of tomatoes that were still green but promising. And Cole came out to find her not for any particular reason, just to be somewhere that wasn't inside. He sat on the fence rail and watched her work for a while without saying anything. He did this sometimes now. She had stopped being surprised by it. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "Yes," she said, without looking up from the bean row. "Did you know? When you agreed to come here, did you know it would turn into this?" She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was looking at the garden, not at her, in the way he asked difficult questions, sideways, with an escape route built in. "No," she said. I thought I was making a practical decision to survive a winter. And now? She thought about how to answer this. She had the instinct, briefly, to give him something measured and careful that wouldn't complicate anything. Then she decided that he was 13 years old and had asked her a direct question with genuine curiosity and deserved a direct answer. Now it's not practical anymore, she said. It's something else, something I didn't plan for. Cole was quiet for a moment. Does he know that? I don't think so, she said. Not clearly. Are you going to tell him? When it's the right time, she said. I'm not going to force something that has to move at its own pace. Cole chewed on this. She went back to the beans. After a while, he said very carefully, she wouldn't have wanted him to be alone forever. She stopped. Mama, he said, still looking at the garden. She wasn't that kind of person. She used to say that the worst thing you could do was waste time being less than what you could be. He paused. She said it about a lot of things, but I think... He stopped. You think she'd have applied it here, Lydia said quietly. I think she'd have told him to stop being an idiot, Cole said, with a raw frankness that was so entirely his own that Lydia had to press her mouth together for a moment. She looked at the boy on the fence rail. This boy who had stood in her kitchen doorway in January with his arms crossed, measuring her for every deficiency, and who had arrived where he was now by a route that had not been easy for either of them. She raised a good son, Lydia said. Cole looked at the garden. His face did something complicated. She raised 2 of them, he said. The other one's just louder about it. Lydia laughed. A real laugh, sudden and genuine. And Cole looked startled for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth pulled up, reluctantly, into something that was undeniably a smile. They didn't talk about it again. But something had shifted between them. Some final piece of distance collapsed, and after that afternoon, Cole stopped positioning himself slightly outside things and started positioning himself slightly inside them, which was a difference that meant everything and looked like nothing from the outside. The moment with Wade came on a Saturday evening in mid-July. It was not dramatic. This was the thing about real moments. They almost never are. She had been in the front room, going through her teaching materials for the fall session, sorting and organizing with the pleasant efficiency of someone doing familiar work. Wade had come in from the fields, washed up, and appeared in the doorway of the front room with his hair still damp and no particular excuse for being there. Am I interrupting? He said. No, she said. Come in if you want. He came in. He looked at her materials spread across the low table and sat down in the armchair across from her. Not the rocking chair, never the rocking chair, but the worn leather armchair that had always been his. He sat down and watched her sort papers and didn't say anything. She worked. He watched. The summer evening light came through the window and the house was quiet because the boys were somewhere outside doing something that involved a rope and the big oak tree and the levels of risk she had chosen not to investigate too closely. After a while, he said, I owe you something. She looked up. An apology, he said. He was looking at his hands, which were on his knees, for the way I thought about this, about you, when you first came. Wade, let me finish. He looked up. I brought you in, and I told myself it was honest because I told you what the terms were. But I wasn't thinking of you as a whole person. I was thinking of you as a solution to a problem, and I dressed it up in plain language and called it honesty. And it wasn't, not entirely. She put down the papers she was holding. She gave him her full attention. You are... He stopped. Tried again. I've watched you this spring. What you built with those children and what you built with my sons, and what you did the night of the raid, and the way you... He stopped again. She could see that this was genuinely difficult for him, not because he didn't know what he wanted to say, but because saying it meant opening something he'd been keeping closed with both hands for a long time. I've been doing you a disservice by keeping you where I put you in the beginning, he said. And I think part of me knew that months ago and didn't do anything about it because I didn't know how. Why now? She said. He looked at her directly. Because I'm tired, he said. I'm tired of being careful about it. I'm tired of treating what's here between us like it's something that needs to be managed instead of something that's... He stopped. Something that's real, she said. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. She looked at him in the evening light, this man who had opened his door in a blizzard and offered her survival and gotten something neither of them had bargained for, and she thought about what it cost him to sit in that chair and say what he'd just said. She knew how he operated. She knew the precise effort it required to crack that compression even slightly. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I'm not Rachel," she said. "I know you know that, but I want to say it plainly because I think it needs to be said between us, out loud, and not left as something we both understand but never name." She kept her voice level and her eyes on his. "I can't be what she was to you or to this house. I don't want to be. And I don't want you to be trying to figure out whether you're somehow being disloyal to her memory by whatever this is, because I don't think you are." Something moved across his face, something that had been under pressure for a long time. "I think she would have wanted her boys to have a household that was alive," Lydia said, "and I think she would have wanted you to stop running the house like a man who's waiting for something to end." She paused. "You don't have to agree with me, but I wanted to say it." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, one of the boys yelled something at the other one, and there was the sound of running on the grass, and then whatever the dispute was apparently resolved itself without adult intervention. "She would have liked you," Wade said. Came out quietly, almost to himself. "I think I would have liked her," Lydia said, and she meant it. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor for a moment. She could see him working through something. She'd learned to read the quality of his silences, which one was him being closed off and which one was him actually thinking. This was him actually thinking. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I knew how to. The first time I was 22 and she was 19 and it was uncomplicated. It just happened." He looked up. "This is not that. This is something I have to decide to do. And I don't have a very good track record with decisions made out of." He paused. "Feeling?" she offered. "Feeling," he agreed without embarrassment. "You make decisions out of feeling all the time," she said. "You just call them practical so you don't have to sit with the discomfort of it." He stared at her. "The school?" she said. "You said yes in 30 seconds. You didn't need 30 seconds to figure out the logistics. You said yes because something in you recognized it was right." She kept her voice matter of fact. "You went to Cedar Falls yourself, with Denny and Cal, in the middle of a complicated situation because something in you couldn't let other people carry the weight of it alone. You don't decide from the outside in, Wade. You decide from the inside, and then you build the reasoning around it afterward." He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, like someone had described him to himself in a way that was accurate enough to be slightly uncomfortable. "That's," he started. "Accurate?" she said. "Unsettling," he said. "You asked me to be honest," she reminded him, "months ago. That was your one condition." The corner of his mouth moved. "I did say that." She looked at him. The evening light had shifted while they'd been talking, gone from gold to something softer and lower, and the room was gentler in it. She was aware that this was a crossroads moment, the kind that don't announce themselves clearly, but that you can feel in the particular quality of the air. "You don't have to decide anything right now," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." She said it plainly. "But I want you to know that what's here, from my side, is real. Not the arrangement, not the practical decision, something past that." She picked up her papers again. "That's all I wanted to say." He sat in the armchair for another few minutes. She went back to her sorting. Neither of them said anything more. Then he stood up and walked to the door. He stopped there. "Lydia," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her in the doorway with those gray-green eyes, and whatever it was that had been compressed and careful and contained for so many months had shifted in his face into something more like its actual shape. "Thank you," he said, "for saying it." "Thank you for listening to it," she said. He nodded once and went. She sat in the quiet front room and breathed out slowly and thought, "All right, that's done. That's out in the world now." It felt on balance like the right thing. August came, and with it the final piece of the legal proceedings. Abbott sent a letter that Wade read at the kitchen table with Lydia across from him and Cole leaning over his shoulder with no pretense of not being interested. Garrett Pell had been located in Cheyenne, Wyoming, where he had been operating under a variation of his name, Gary Pellman, which, as Cole pointed out, was not exactly a masterwork of disguise. He was in territorial custody. The 5 men arrested at Black Hollow had accepted reduced sentences in exchange for testimony against Pell and against the Northern Continental Land Acquisition Operation, which turned out to be significantly larger than even Wade had suspected. 11 properties across 2 counties, 3 of which had involved physical intimidation, substantial enough to constitute criminal coercion. 11, Lydia said. 11, Wade confirmed. He set the letter down. The families that sold, Abbott thinks there's a case for recovery of damages. It'll take time, but it's there. Cole straightened up from behind his father's shoulder. So it's over, he said. The criminal part, Wade said. The legal proceedings will drag on, but the operation is done. Eli, who had been eating an apple at the end of the table with the dedicated focus he brought to all eating, looked up. Does that mean nobody's going to cut our fence anymore? That's what it means, Wade said. Eli took another bite of his apple. Good, he said, and went back to it. Cole looked at the letter. Then he looked at Lydia. Something in his expression was calculated and deliberate in a way that made her faintly cautious. Now that it's settled, Cole said carefully, with the conversational innocence of someone who has been constructing a sentence for several days, you're both staying, right? Permanently. The kitchen was very quiet. Wade looked at Lydia. Lydia looked at Cole, who looked back at her with an expression of absolute neutrality that was completely unconvincing. You have been thinking about saying that for a while, she said. Maybe, Cole said. It's not an unfair question, Wade said. He was still looking at Lydia. She held his gaze. I told you I wasn't going anywhere, she said. Things have changed since you said that, he said. The legal situation is resolved. Pell is in custody. You could... He paused. Your reasons for staying have changed. My reasons for staying, she said evenly, have nothing to do with Garrett Pell. Something in Wade's face settled. Not dramatically, just settled. Okay, he said. But I want it said properly, she said, not just implied and left hanging. She looked at him across the kitchen table. Do you want me to stay? Not as a practical arrangement, not as the woman who manages the house and runs the school, as... She stopped. As what's actually here. Cole had apparently decided this was a moment that called for him to become very interested in the middle distance. Wade was quiet for a moment. She could see him deciding whether to manage it or just say it. He chose to say it. Yes, he said, simply. Yes, I want you to stay. Not poetry, not eloquence, not the kind of declaration that gets written down, but it was true. And she could see that it was true. And from Wade Coulter, that simple word had cost enough that she understood exactly the weight of it. Eli lowered his apple. He had clearly been watching this exchange over its rim with careful attention. So you're our mother now? He said. For real? Eli, Wade started. I'm not replacing anyone, Lydia said, and she said it gently but directly, looking at the boy. I'm not your mother, and I'm not trying to be, but I am. She thought for a moment about how to say this to a 7-year-old who had stood at the top of the stairs with a candle asking if she was real. I am yours, she said. That's the truest way I know to put it. Whatever that looks like going forward, I'm yours. Eli considered this with the seriousness he applied to most things. Okay, he said, apparently satisfied. He bit his apple again. Cole was still looking at the middle distance, but she could see in the line of his shoulders and the set of his jaw that he was not as neutral as he was trying to appear. Later, much later, after supper and the boys in bed and the house settling into its night sounds, she was in the kitchen putting out the lamp when Wade came back downstairs. She heard him on the stairs and then in the hallway and then at the kitchen doorway. She turned. He was standing in the doorway the way he'd stood in it the first night she was here, big and quiet, a little uncertain in a way he'd never admit to. But the uncertainty now had a different quality than the flat appraisal of that first night. It was the uncertainty of someone who is standing at a threshold and is aware of it. He crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of her. There were a few feet between them, not much, but enough that it had to be a deliberate choice to close it, for either of them. He put his hand against the side of her face, carefully, the way you do something you've been thinking about for a long time and want to do right. His palm was rough from work. His thumb moved once, very slightly, along her cheekbone. She stayed very still. "I'm not good at this," he said. His voice was low. "I should tell you that in advance. I don't say things well. I didn't when I was young, and I'm less likely to now." "You've been saying things pretty well tonight," she said. "I've been trying harder than usual," he said. And there it was again, that almost laugh, the shadow of one, in his voice. She reached up and put her hand over his where it rested against her face. She felt his breath change slightly at that. "We'll figure it out," she said. "That's what we do." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he leaned down and kissed her, careful and deliberate and completely without pretense. And it was nothing like a fairy tale and everything like a real thing between two people who had earned the right to be standing in this kitchen together. When he pulled back, she kept her eyes closed for a moment. Not for drama, just because it seemed right to take a second with it. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. Outside, the Montana summer night was enormous and full of stars, and the sounds of a ranch that was alive, cattle in the fields, a horse shifting in the barn, the creek beyond the south pasture running fast with snowmelt that would settle into something quieter come fall. Inside, the house stood around them with all its accumulated history and its patched wall and its rocking chair that no one sat in and its blue ceramic pitcher on the windowsill and its two sleeping boys and its years of grief that had not disappeared but had somehow, over the course of one long, terrible, beautiful winter, made room for something new alongside it. It was not fixed. People don't fix, not cleanly. Cole was still prickly on bad days, and Wade was still a man who communicated in right angles when feeling pressed him. And Lydia still had nightmares occasionally about the night of the raid, about the hallway and the sound the shotgun made and the two men's faces in the dark. None of it was clean, none of it was finished, but it was real, and it was theirs. And as they stood in the kitchen in the low light, she thought about a blizzard in January and a knock on a stranger's door and a man who had offered her survival and gotten himself something he hadn't been looking for. She thought it was probably the most practical thing either of them had ever done, and she thought, in the end, that practical and real were not as far apart as she'd always assumed. The second wall coat went on in September, and it matched the rest of the kitchen almost exactly. Wade stood back and looked at it with the critical eye of someone who knows the difference between good enough and actually right, and then he turned to Lydia and said, "You can't tell." "You can a little," she said. He looked again. "Where?" "The texture's slightly smoother on the patch, in morning light." She considered it. "It's not bad. It's just different." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I can live with different." She looked at him. He was looking at the wall, not at her, but she understood that they were not entirely talking about the wall, and she thought it was one of the better things he'd said to her in 9 months of marriage, and she let it land without pointing at it. "Good," she said, "because different is mostly what we've got." He went back outside. She went back to the bread she was making, and Black Hollow Ranch continued its business of existing, imperfectly and stubbornly, the way it always had. Autumn in Montana does not ease in. It arrives with intention, the mornings going cold seemingly overnight, frost on the grass before the end of September that crunches under boots and sends the cattle pressing together in the early hours for warmth. The aspens along the creek turned yellow so fast it looked like something had been spilled on them. Lydia stood at the kitchen window one morning in late September and watched the light hit those trees and felt something she had been carrying since January, a kind of low-grade tension she hadn't fully named, quietly let go. She had made it through a year, not a calendar year. A year of the kind that counts. A year of earning her place in a house that hadn't wanted her, in a community that hadn't trusted her, in a family that had been broken before she arrived and was still in the process of becoming something else. That kind of year. The kind you don't celebrate because you're too tired and too close to it, but that matters in the accounting of what a person is capable of when they stop waiting to be rescued and start doing what needs doing. The school reopened the second week of September with 9 students, and Petra Brennan had grown 3 inches, and her mathematics had outpaced everything Lydia could reasonably teach with the materials she had. She wrote a careful letter to the county education office in Helena requesting additional resources and, after some internal debate, requesting an assessment of Black Hollow School for potential formal recognition as a district schoolhouse. It was ambitious. She sent it anyway. That'll take months, Wade said, reading the draft she'd shown him. Not critically, just accurately. Probably, she said. But the answer exists somewhere between sending the letter and not sending it. He handed it back. Send it, he said. The reply came in November. It was encouraging in the cautious, bureaucratic way of government correspondence. Not a yes, but a yes is possible, and here are the steps. She read it twice at the kitchen table and then set it down and sat with it for a while. She had been a dismissed school teacher with 11 silver coins 10 months ago. She thought about that woman, walking through the snow with a cracked boot sole, navigating by fence posts in a blizzard, knocking on a door she had no reason to believe would open. She didn't feel sorry for that woman anymore. She felt something closer to respect, for the stubbornness of her, the refusal to lie down in the snow and let the situation win. Life does not reward people for deserving things. It doesn't work that way, and anyone who has lived long enough knows it. What it occasionally does, not always, not reliably, but occasionally, is offer a door. And the door requires you to knock on it, in bad weather, when you're not sure anyone is home. Most people, in Lydia's experience, stood outside in the cold deciding whether to knock until the decision was made for them. She had knocked. That was the whole of it when you stripped it down. She had knocked. The legal proceedings finalized in October. Garrett Pell was convicted on 7 counts of criminal coercion and conspiracy to defraud across 2 territories and sentenced to 8 years in the Territorial Penitentiary in Deer Lodge. The judge noted in his summary that the operation had been notable for its patience and its organization, that Pell had spent nearly 2 years systematically dismantling small ranching operations, timing his pressure to coincide with difficult seasons, choosing targets that were isolated enough to resist collectively. What the judge did not note, because it was not the court's business to note it, was that the operation had stopped at Black Hollow, that it had run into a woman standing in a dark hallway with a shotgun who had decided, in the space of a few seconds, that the thing worth protecting was worth protecting with everything she had, that the evidence that ultimately brought the case together, the notebook, the survey map, Clara Holt's signed testimony, the accumulated pattern that Abbott had been able to take to the prosecutor, had started in large part with a late-night conversation in a kitchen between a rancher who had learned to think out loud and a school teacher who had learned from her father to follow a thing all the way back to where it started. Wade came home from Cedar Falls after the sentencing and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at his hands for a while. "It's done," he said. "Yes," she said, "all of it." She looked at him. He didn't look relieved exactly. He looked like a man who has been braced against something for a long time and is slowly, carefully, unclenching. It takes longer to unclench than to brace. The muscles remember the tension. "How do you feel?" she asked. He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. "Tired," he said. "Like I've been holding something heavy and just put it down. And now my arms are just tired." "That's allowed," she said. He looked up at her. "I keep thinking about the families that sold," he said. "The 3 that left before we—" He stopped. "If we'd been 6 months earlier. If we'd gotten the evidence 6 months earlier." "We weren't," she said, "and you can't carry what you couldn't have stopped." "I know that," he said. "Knowing it and not carrying it are different things," she said. "I know you know that too." He made the almost laugh sound. It was more of an actual laugh now than it had been in January. Still not generous, still quiet, but real. "You've been storing that one up," he said. "I had it ready," she admitted. "I've been waiting for the right moment." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Briefly, simply, the way he did things when he wasn't thinking about how to do them. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it." "You already said that once," she said, "back at the beginning." "It applies more now," he said. She turned her hand under his and held it for a moment. Then she let go and stood up to start supper, and he sat at the table and watched her, and the kitchen was warm and the October wind was doing its business outside. And that was an ordinary evening at Black Hollow Ranch, imperfect and sufficient and real. Cole turned 13 in November. He asked for and received his own chess set, a simpler one than the ivory and ebony set in the bookshelf, but one that was entirely his. He had also, over the autumn, begun joining the school sessions not as a student exactly, but as something closer to an assistant. He had a particular gift for explaining mathematics to the younger children, A patience with repetition that surprised Lydia until she realized it didn't surprise her at all. He was his father's son in most things, and his father was a man who did difficult things without complaint and without needing to be thanked for them. She told him this directly one afternoon after the students had gone home and he was cleaning the chalk dust off the boards. "You're good at teaching," she said. He shrugged. "It's just explaining things." "That's what teaching is," she said. "Most people aren't good at it. You are." He worked the cloth across the board. "Mama wanted me to be a lawyer," he said. "She said I argued well enough to get paid for it." "She wasn't wrong," Lydia said. "You could still do that." He thought about it. "What did you want to be when you were my age?" She considered. "I wanted to write books," she said. "Stories. I thought I'd grow up and live in a city somewhere and write novels." He looked at her over his shoulder. "What happened?" "Life," she said, "which is not a bad trade when you look at what you get for it. It's just not what you planned." Cole looked at the chessboard for a moment. "Is this what you planned?" he said. "All this? Black Hollow? Us?" "No," she said. "None of it." "But you stayed." "But I stayed," she said. He was quiet. Then he picked up the cloth again and finished the board, and the conversation was apparently over, in the way his conversations usually ended. Not with a conclusion, but with the matter simply being completed, set aside, absorbed into whatever he was building internally out of the materials the world kept handing him. He was going to be fine. Not because it had been easy or because the loss of his mother had stopped hurting. It hadn't. She knew that. She had heard him sometimes at night when he thought the house was asleep. The particular silence of a boy who was crying and determined not to be heard doing it. She had never gone to his door. It was not her place. But she had always been awake when it happened, and she thought that mattered, even unacknowledged. Someone awake in the dark who knows you're there. He was going to be fine because he was 12, now 13, and resilient in the specific way of people who have been hurt and gotten up and kept going, and because he had a father who loved him with a consistency that never wavered even when it couldn't always find words, and because he had Eli, who treated everything in life, including grief, with an openness that was either extraordinary emotional intelligence or the natural temperament of someone born facing toward the light. And because he had in the end let Lydia in. Not easily and not all at once, but in. That mattered too. December came, and with it a cold that was different from the killing cold of the previous January. More familiar now, less threatening. She knew this cold. She knew how to bank the stove against it and how to read the sky when it intended something serious and where the worst drafts came through the walls and what to put against them. She knew the sounds the house made in deep cold, its particular vocabulary of creeks and settlements. She knew this place, and it, in whatever way a place can know a person, knew her back. Wade had been carrying something private since November. She noticed it the way she noticed most things about him now, not because he showed it, but because she had learned the shape of his normal and could see when something was occupying space alongside it. He wasn't troubled exactly. He was thoughtful, planning something. She did not ask. She had learned that with Wade, asking before he was ready produced a shorter, less honest version of whatever the thing was. Waiting produced the real one. He came to her on a Thursday evening in the middle of December. The boys were in bed and the kitchen was quiet, and she was at the table writing her monthly letter to Margaret in Nebraska, who had become, over the course of a year of increasingly honest correspondence, something closer to a confidant than she'd had in a long time. He sat down across from her. He put his hands on the table. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to hear the whole thing before you answer." She set down her pen. She folded her hands. She gave him her full attention. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. "When we married," he said, "it was a transaction. You know that, and I know that, and we've both made our peace with what it was." He paused. "But it's not that anymore. It hasn't been that for a long time. And I've been thinking—" He stopped, started again. "I've been thinking that I want to do it again." She looked at him. "Do what again?" "Marry you," he said. "The right way. Not in this kitchen with a justice of the peace who couldn't leave fast enough. Not as a contract." He met her eyes. "In front of people. In front of the community. With the whole thing. However you want the whole thing to look." She was quiet. "I know it's the same legal document," he said, and she could hear that he had thought about this a great deal because he was already addressing the objections. I know it doesn't change anything on paper, but it changes. He paused. I want people to know it's real. I want you to have that, because you never had it the first time and you should have had it. He looked at his hands briefly, and I want to say it out loud. The real version, in front of witnesses. She looked at Wade Coulter across the kitchen table, this man who had said more in the last 5 minutes than he typically said in a week, and she thought about the January night she had sat on the edge of a strange bed and decided that an honest contract was better than a comfortable lie. She thought about the months between then and now, everything they had walked through, the fence lines and the ambush and the hallway and the long, slow work of building something real in a house full of old grief. The chess games and the almost laughs, and the hands placed carefully on faces in dimly lit kitchens. The boy at the top of the stairs with a candle. The boy in the kitchen doorway who had slowly, grudgingly let her in. She thought about what it meant that this man, who communicated in right angles and called his feelings practical so he didn't have to sit with them, had planned a second wedding. Yes, she said, I'd like that. Something in his face released, not dramatically, but she saw it. Cole knows, he said. He helped me plan it. He paused. He was more enthusiastic than I expected. Of course he was, she said. He has opinions about the food, Wade said, with a tone that suggested the opinions had been numerous and specific. Of course he does, she said. The wedding happened on a Saturday in late December, 2 weeks before the new year, which was 1888, and which Lydia privately noted she had not been entirely sure she would survive to see when she was walking through the blizzard 12 months earlier. It was not what anyone would call elaborate. Black Hollow Ranch in winter did not lend itself to elaboration. But Wade had done something she had not expected. He had quietly, over the previous month, invited the community. Not just Clara Holt and her husband, not just the Brennan family, the families of all 9 school children, the ranch hands and their families. Ed Ferris, who had told Wade about his neighbor's pressured sale, and who had come forward as a witness during the legal proceedings. The county prosecutor Abbott, who showed up in his Sunday coat looking slightly less humorless than usual. The marshal's deputy, who had driven out from Cedar Falls in his own time. They filled the front room and spilled into the hallway, and a few hardy ones stood on the porch with the door open, bundled in coats. Lydia stood at the top of the stairs in her best dress, not the blue wool she'd worn in January, but a dress Clara Holt had helped her find in Cedar Falls in November, dark green, well-fitted, with none of the too large through-the-shoulders quality of the first one, and looked down at the crowded house and felt something go through her that she was not prepared for. These were the people who had whispered about her in January, the ones who had heard the story of the woman who walked out of a blizzard and married a widower she'd known for 6 days and measured her against a woman they'd loved and found her wanting. Some of them were the same people. Some of them had sent their children to her school and watched her and revised their opinion over months of ordinary evidence. Some of them, she suspected, still weren't sure about her and had come anyway, because that's what you do in a small community when something is happening. You show up and you make your judgment in person. She was glad they'd come, all of them, even the uncertain ones. Clara Holt was at the front of the room and caught Lydia's eye when she appeared at the top of the stairs and gave her a look that managed to communicate approximately 7 different things simultaneously, the primary one being, I knew you'd be fine here. I knew it before you did. Lydia thought that was a generous revision of history, but she appreciated it. Eli was at the bottom of the stairs waiting for her. He was wearing his good clothes with the serious ceremonial bearing of someone who has been given an important function and takes it with the appropriate gravity. He was 8 years old, and he had grown nearly 2 inches since January, and he was going to be tall. You look nice, he said. Thank you, she said. So do you. Cole helped me with my collar, he said. He said I was doing it wrong. He considered this. I was doing it wrong. Cole's good at noticing things, she said. He notices everything, Eli agreed, with the philosophical acceptance of a younger sibling who has lived with this reality for his entire life. He held out his arm with a formality that was very nearly adult. Are you ready? She took his arm. Yes, she said. I'm ready. Wade was standing at the front of the room next to a minister from Cedar Falls who had agreed to come out for the occasion and who had, Unlike the first justice of the peace, the manner of someone who was genuinely glad to be there. Wade was wearing a jacket she hadn't seen before, dark wool, properly fitted, and he had shaved that morning with an attention to detail she had noted and not commented on. He was looking at her as she came down the stairs with an expression that she had no trouble reading at all. She had gotten quite good at reading him. Cole was standing to his father's left. He had his arms at his sides instead of crossed, which was the most obvious possible signal that he was choosing to be open to this moment, rather than armored against it. He looked at Lydia when she reached the front of the room, and what crossed his face was complicated and human and exactly right. Grief and acceptance, and something that was making its way slowly toward a new kind of love. The chosen kind. The kind you arrive at through difficulty rather than biology. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The minister was brief and warm and said the things that needed saying without ornamentation. When he got to the part where Wade was supposed to speak, Wade looked at Lydia and said, "Not to the minister, not to the room, but to her specifically. I've been given a second chance at something I thought I'd finished with," he said. "I did not earn it. I did not plan it. It knocked on my door in a blizzard, and it has refused consistently to be managed or minimized or kept at a comfortable distance." He paused. "I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for the stubbornness of it." He looked at her. "I'm grateful for you. Whatever comes next, I want it to be with you." He was not a man who made speeches. She could see what it had cost him to put those sentences together. She thought they were, for that reason, more valuable than a practiced eloquence would have been. She had thought about what she would say. She had written 3 versions and discarded all of them. In the end, she looked at him and said, "I walked through a blizzard toward a maybe," she said. "I knocked on your door because I had run out of easier options, and I was not expecting anything more than to survive the night. I got this family instead. I got this house, and these boys, and this impossible man who asked me to be honest with him, and then was honest right back." She paused. "I would choose it. I want you to know that, not because I had to, not because I was desperate. Given the choice to do it all again from the beginning, I would choose every difficult bit of it, because it brought me here." Eli made a small sound from somewhere to her left that suggested he was fighting with his own emotions with limited success. She did not look at him because she knew that if she looked at him, she was going to lose her composure entirely, and she had made it this far. The minister continued. The words were said, the same words from different mouths than January, and when Wade put the ring on her finger this time, it was not a plain band bought practically in Cedar Falls, but something he had gotten from a jeweler. She found out later he'd corresponded with one in Billings for 2 months. A simple gold ring with a small engraving on the interior that she couldn't read until afterward, in the quiet of the kitchen, when she held it up to the lamp. It said, "Black Hollow, chosen." She stood in the kitchen alone for a moment with that ring and those 2 words and the sound of the celebration in the front room behind her. Voices she recognized. Eli's laugh distinctive above the others, Cole's lower and more restrained but genuinely there. And she let herself feel the full weight of it. She had been a dismissed schoolteacher with 11 silver coins. She had walked into a blizzard toward a maybe, and this was what the maybe had turned out to be. A house that knew her, a man who had learned to say true things out loud, a boy who had taught her chess grudgingly and then stopped being grudging about it, a boy who had asked at the top of the stairs if she was real, a school full of children who wanted to be river engineers and lawyers and things their parents hadn't imagined yet. A patched wall that you could see was different only in the morning light. She slid the ring back on her finger and went back to her family. The celebration went on into the evening, and someone, she suspected Clara Holt, who had clearly taken a proprietary interest in the occasion, had brought enough food to feed everyone twice, and Harold Holt and Denny Marsh got into an argument about cattle breeding that lasted 40 minutes and was deeply entertaining to everyone nearby, and Eli fell asleep on the settee at 8 o'clock, surrounded by 3 of his school friends, who were also losing the battle. And Cole spent an hour in conversation with the deputy marshal from Cedar Falls about something that made him look serious and interested in a way she filed away for later. Wade found her at the edge of the room sometime around 9, when the evening was starting to thin and people were beginning the business of wrapping up and making the cold ride home. He stood beside her, and they watched the room together. Their room, their house, their people. And he said nothing for a while, and she said nothing. and it was comfortable in the way that silences between two people become comfortable when they've earned it. Cole spent 3 weeks planning the food, he said finally. He wrote a list. I know, she said. He showed it to me in October. He wanted my input. Wade looked at her. He showed you in October. Yes. He was helping me plan a surprise for you, Wade said slowly. He was, she agreed. He's not very good at keeping secrets from me. He's better at keeping them from you. Wade looked at the ceiling briefly, with the expression of a man recalibrating several months of assumed privacy. Then he looked back at the room and something crossed his face that was not quite exasperation and not quite fondness and was entirely its own thing. He's a good kid, he said. He's a remarkable kid, she said. He's going to be difficult and brilliant, and he's going to argue with you about everything for the next 10 years. And then he's going to be exactly the kind of man you'd want standing next to you when things get hard. Wade was quiet for a moment. You see that in him. I see what's already there, she said. That's the whole job. That's all teaching ever is. People began leaving. There were handshakes and embraces, and Clara Holt hugged Lydia with a warmth that had none of the calculation of that first February visit and said into her ear, I blamed you for Thomas wanting to be an engineer. I should have thanked you instead. Petra Brennan's mother pressed Lydia's hands and said simply, Don't stop. Ed Ferris shook Wade's hand for a long time and said something quiet that Lydia didn't catch, and that made Wade nod once, slowly, with the gravity of a man receiving something he hadn't known he needed. The deputy marshal, on his way out, stopped and spoke to Cole for another few minutes. Cole listened with that particular focused stillness he had. She caught his eye over the deputy's shoulder and raised a questioning eyebrow. Cole gave her a look that said, later. Later, when the last guests had gone and Eli had been carried to bed by his father and the front room was returned to its own quiet, Cole sat at the kitchen table with his coat still on and said, Deputy Marshal Hendricks says the county is looking to establish a proper circuit court in this district. He says they'll need people who know the land and the communities. He looked at the table. He said a man who is willing to read law could find a place in it. Lydia sat down across from him. What did you say? I said I was 13, Cole said. He said he'd be around in a few years. She looked at the boy across the kitchen table, the lamp between them, his serious, angular face that was going to be his father's face and something entirely its own as well. What do you want? She said. He thought about it with genuine seriousness. I want to be someone who fixes things, he said. The right way. Not the way Pell was fixing things. The actual right way. He paused. Mama said the law is just the agreement people make about how to treat each other. She said the problem is people keep forgetting they made it. Lydia was quiet for a moment. She was right, she said. She usually was, he said. And there was no anguish in it, just the honest assessment of someone who loved a person clearly, with their flaws included and their gifts acknowledged. It was the healthiest thing she'd heard him say about his mother, and she recognized it for what it was without making a production of it. Read law then, she said. When you're ready, I'll help you find the books. He looked at her. Something in his face that had nothing to do with chess or argument or the careful management of his own feelings settled into something simpler. Okay, he said. He went to bed. She sat in the kitchen alone for a while. She seemed to always end up in the kitchen alone at the end of significant days, and she had stopped thinking of it as loneliness and started thinking of it as a kind of decompression, the place where she took the day apart quietly and made sense of it. Wade came downstairs at some point and sat across from her, and they didn't say much for a while, and what they said was ordinary, about the morning and the cattle and whether the creek's near bank needed shoring up before hard freeze. And it was the kind of conversation that sounds like nothing from the outside. And from the inside sounds exactly like a life. Outside, Black Hollow Ranch spread itself across the dark Montana land. The fields quiet under frost, the barn warm with animal heat, the eastern boundary with its repaired fences standing solid against whatever weather came next. The patched wall in the kitchen, the rocking chair in the front room that Lydia had finally, 2 weeks ago, sat in just once, tentatively, and then more comfortably, because a chair is a chair and grief deserves to be honored but not worshipped, and because Rachel Coulter, by all accounts, was not the kind of woman who wanted things preserved in amber at the expense of the living. The blue ceramic pitcher was still on the windowsill. In spring, Lydia planned to put flowers in it, yellow ones, if she could find them near the creek, the kind that smelled like pepper. Some things you inherit, some things you choose. The real art of a life, she had come to think, is knowing the difference and being willing to carry both with honesty. She had arrived at Black Hollow with nothing she'd chosen and everything she'd been handed, dismissed, broke, storm-caught, desperate. She had stayed by choosing to. She had built what she'd built by deciding every morning that it was worth building. That was the whole lesson, if there was one. Not that the world rewards good people or punishes bad ones, because it doesn't, not reliably. Not that love fixes what's broken, because it doesn't do that either. It just makes the broken parts more bearable to live alongside. The lesson, if you could call it that, was simpler and harder than any of those. Show up. Do the work. Let the real things be real. Knock on the door in the blizzard. The wind came off the mountains and swept across the land, and the house held against it the way it always had. Not perfectly, not without cost, but solidly and together. That was enough. That had always been enough.